I remember the exact moment my cousin Dana looked at the cardboard box in my hands and laughed. And not a polite laugh. Not a nervous laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from somewhere deep in a person's chest where their real feelings live. The kind of laugh that says everything they have been holding back for years. "And she left you her scrubs," Dana said, wiping the corner of her eye. That is so fitting, honestly, and the whole room shifted. Aunts and uncles and cousins who had driven in from 3 different states for Grandma Ruth's funeral were standing in the living room of her small house in rural Tennessee, holding their assigned items from the will. Dana had gotten the pearl earrings. My Aunt Marjorie had gotten the china set that she had been eyeing for 20 years. My Uncle Preston had gotten the antique clock that sat on the mantel. And I had gotten a cardboard box sealed with packing tape labeled in Grandma Ruth's handwriting, for Eleanor. "Do not open until you are alone." And everyone assumed it was old uniforms. Old medical textbooks. The kinds of things nobody else wanted. The kinds of things you leave to the granddaughter who nobody takes seriously. And I stood there holding that box and I smiled at Dana and I said nothing. And that was 6 months ago. And my name is Eleanor May Whitfield and I am 34 years old and I have spent most of my adult life being the quiet one. The practical one. The one who showed up every Sunday to have lunch with Grandma Ruth while everyone else was busy living their bigger, louder lives. The one who drove 4 hours round trip every time she had a doctor's appointment after her hip surgery. The one who sat with her through 2 rounds of chemotherapy and held her hand during the night shifts when the pain was bad. And nobody in my family ever called that devotion. They called it having no life. And I want to tell you who my grandmother really was before I tell you what was in that box. Because the money is part of the story, but it is not the whole story. The whole story is about a woman who lived quietly and gave loudly and trusted the one person who actually saw her. And Ruth Annette Holloway was born in 1942 in a small town in eastern Tennessee. She was the daughter of a coal miner and a schoolteacher. They were not poor in the way that breaks people, but they were poor in the way that shapes people. They counted every dollar. They wasted nothing. They believed that how you treated people when you had nothing was the truest measure of your character. And Grandma Ruth decided she wanted to be a nurse when she was 11 years old and her little brother got sick with a fever that the local doctor almost missed. She watched the nurse who came to the house that night move with this calm authority and this deep gentleness at the same time, and she thought, that is what I want to be. And she graduated nursing school in 1963. She joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1965. And she went to Vietnam. And she spent 2 tours caring for wounded soldiers in conditions that I cannot fully imagine. She talked about it rarely and only in pieces. A story here. A name there. Sometimes she would go quiet in the middle of telling a story and just look out the window for a while. I learned not to rush her back. I learned that some memories needed breathing room. And she came home in 1968. She married my grandfather Thomas, who was a quiet man who loved her deeply and worked as an electrician for 30 years. They had 2 children. My mother Susan and my uncle Preston. They bought a small house in Tennessee and they lived in it for 56 years. And from the outside my grandparents looked like a couple who never had very much. Their house was modest. Their car was always a few years old. Grandma Ruth clipped coupons until the day she died. She made gifts instead of buying them. She wore the same winter coat for 15 years. When people asked her if she needed anything, she always said she had everything she needed. And my family interpreted this as evidence that Grandma Ruth had struggled her whole life. They pitted her in the gentle, condescending way that people pity family members they have stopped paying close attention to. And what none of them knew was that Grandma Ruth had been paying very close attention to everything. And I need to tell you something about my grandfather Thomas before I go further. And Thomas Whitfield was not just a quiet man who loved my grandmother. He was also a man with an extraordinary gift for investing. He had started buying land in the 1970s when nobody in their county was thinking about land as an investment. He bought small parcels. He was patient. He held them for decades. He never talked about it because he was not the kind of man who needed anyone to know what he was doing. And when he died in 2011, he left Grandma Ruth significantly more than anyone in the family realized. Not because they tried to deceive anyone, but because they had lived their whole lives with the same modest habits, and there was no reason to change them. And Grandma Ruth took what Grandfather Thomas left her, and she made it grow. Quietly. Carefully. The same way she had done everything her entire life. And she worked with a financial advisor. A woman named Patricia Chin, who I would later come to know very well. She diversified the investments. She was conservative where she needed to be and patient always. She lived off a modest income and let the rest compound. And she built a trust. And she designed it carefully over the course of many years with Patricia and with an estate attorney. She knew exactly what she was doing and she knew exactly why. And I did not know any of this when I was driving 4 hours round trip to take her to chemotherapy. I was not being kind to her because I expected anything. I want to be very clear about that. I showed up because she was my grandmother, and she was the person in my family who had always made me feel like I was worth something. And let me tell you about the rest of my family for a moment, because context matters. And my mother, Susan, is a good woman who loves me, but she has always been easily influenced by what other people think. She married my father when she was young, and when they divorced when I was 12, she sort of drifted into whatever her social circle told her was respectable. She remarried a man named Gerald who has opinions about everything and confidence in none of them. They have a nice house and a boat and 2 Labrador retrievers, and they attend a church where everyone seems to agree with each other constantly. And my Uncle Preston is the kind of man who confuses loudness with intelligence. He became a successful insurance salesman in his 30s and decided that this made him an expert on everything. He has 3 children. Dana, who laughed at me, is his oldest. Preston talks about money constantly in the way that people do when they are anxious about it. He name-drops his financial advisor and his golf club membership and the vacation they took to Portugal. And growing up, I was always compared to Dana. Dana was louder. Dana was more confident. Dana got better grades and had more friends and wore the right clothes. Grandma Ruth would try to compliment me and the room would redirect the conversation toward Dana like a river finding its natural course. And what nobody ever seemed to notice was that Dana never once came to see Grandma Ruth in her last 3 years. Not once. And she sent flowers when she heard the cancer had come back. A nice arrangement from an expensive florist with a card that said, "Thinking of you." I know because I was the one who put the flowers in a vase and read her the card and watched my grandmother smile politely in the way she smiled at things that were true but incomplete. And after the funeral, the family gathered at the house to go through the belongings. Grandma Ruth's estate attorney, a man named Robert Simmons, had been in touch with me before the funeral. He had asked me to come to his office after the family gathering. He did not say why. I assumed it had something to do with paperwork or a small account she had wanted me to manage. And I walked into that gathering carrying the knowledge of that upcoming meeting and none of the context for what it might mean. And the will reading was handled informally. Preston had appointed himself the organizer, which was typical. He had a list. He moved through the house pointing out items and reading from the list and directing objects into the hands of their recipients with the efficiency of a man who was very interested in getting this particular thing done. And the pearl earrings went to Dana. And the china went to Marjorie. And the clock went to Preston. And various items went to various cousins and relatives. A quilt here. A piece of furniture there. My mother got the rocking chair she had always liked. And then Preston said my name and pointed to the cardboard box on the kitchen counter. "And Ruth left that for you, Eleanor," he said, and then he was already moving to the next item on his list. And I picked up the box. I felt the weight of it. It was not heavy. I looked at my name in her handwriting, and I held the box against my chest for a moment. And that was when Dana laughed. And the Scrubs comment. The fitting comment. The room shifting just slightly. And I smiled. I said nothing. I held the box. And that night I drove back to my apartment, which is a small 2-bedroom place in Knoxville where I have lived for 8 years. I work as a social worker for a county agency. I help families navigate child welfare systems and housing instability and the kind of bureaucratic fog that makes hard lives harder. I am not well paid for this work. I do not have a boat. I do not have a house with a 3-car garage. And I sat down at my kitchen table with the box and a cup of tea, and I carefully cut the packing tape. And inside there were indeed some folded items of clothing. a set of her Army Nurse Corps dress uniform pieces, a patch with her name and rank, some photographs I had never seen. Ruth in Vietnam looking impossibly young with that same expression she always had, calm and present and not wasting a single moment. And underneath all of this was an envelope. And the envelope was sealed, and on the front she had written in her careful handwriting, Eleanor. My heart. Read this when you are ready. And I put my hand over my mouth for a moment. I breathed. Then I opened it. And the letter was 4 pages long, written in her neat, careful script. I am going to share parts of it with you, but not all of it because some of it belongs only to me. And she started by telling me that she had watched me my whole life. She said that she had seen things in me that she recognized from herself. The willingness to show up. The ability to be quiet and present with someone else's pain. The way I never seemed to need applause for doing the right thing. And she said that in Vietnam she had learned something that never left her. She said, the nurses who saved the most lives were not the ones who were the loudest or the most decorated. They were the ones who could be fully present in a crisis without losing themselves. Eleanor, she wrote, you have always had that. And she told me about Grandfather Thomas. About the land. About what he had left her. She told me about Patricia Chin and the trust she had built over 15 years. She explained the structure in clear, practical terms. She said Patricia would be expecting my call. And then she wrote the number. And I read it 3 times. And $12 million. And held in a trust. Structured to provide me with income immediately while preserving the principal. Designed with flexibility for education or housing or whatever I needed. With clear instructions about the charitable giving she wanted me to continue on her behalf each year to organizations that supported veterans and nurses and rural healthcare. And I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time after I read that letter. And I did not cry immediately. I sat there in the quiet of my small apartment, and I felt something I can only describe as the specific weight of being known. Not discovered. Not surprised by someone else's assessment of your value. Known. Seen over time by someone who watched carefully and understood what they were looking at. And then I cried. And I cried for her. I cried for those photographs of the young woman in Vietnam who had given so much and come home and lived so quietly and built something extraordinary in the secret, patient way that the world rarely applauds. I cried because she was gone and I would never have Sunday lunch with her again, and no amount of money changes that particular grief. And I cried because she had seen me. And I called Patricia Chin the next morning. And Patricia was professional and warm, and had clearly known and respected my grandmother enormously. She walked me through everything with patience and clarity. She had a team ready to help me understand my options. There was no rush, she said. Grandma Ruth had specifically instructed her to give me as much time as I needed. And I spent the next several weeks meeting with Patricia and with the estate attorney Robert Simmons and with a tax advisor Patricia recommended. I asked a lot of questions. I took notes. I went home and researched things and came back with more questions. I was not going to receive this gift carelessly. That felt like the most important thing. And I did not tell my family. And I want to be honest about why. Part of it was that I needed time to process it myself before I could manage anyone else's reaction. Part of it was that I had spent my whole life in that family feeling small and overlooked, and I was not ready to have that dynamic reversed so suddenly and dramatically. I needed to understand who I was with this information before I let other people's responses to it shape me. And part of it, I will be honest, was that I wanted to simply live with the knowledge for a while. To sit with the fact that my grandmother had seen me truly. That felt more valuable than anything else, and I kept going to work. I kept helping my families navigate their systems and their crises. I kept showing up the way I always had. And the family found out 4 months after the funeral. And it was not dramatic. There was no confrontation scene. It happened because Dana ran into Robert Simmons at a community event, and he mentioned in passing that the estate had been fully settled and everything had gone to me. He did not share details, but he confirmed enough. And Dana called my mother. My mother called me. And I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot of a grocery store taking that call. My mother's voice was strange, careful, The way voices get when people are trying to figure out what they are feeling before they say it. And Eleanor, she said, did Grandma Ruth leave you more than the box? And yes, I said. And a pause. And how much more? And I told her. And there was a very long silence. And Eleanor, she said again, and her voice was different now. Softer. Something breaking open in it. I am so sorry. I did not see you. I did not see what you were doing for her. I was not paying attention, and I should have been, and I had not expected that. I had prepared myself for many responses, but not that one. And I told her I loved her. I told her we would talk more. I told her I needed a little more time. And the call with Preston was different. And he called 2 days later, and his voice had that particular quality it gets when he is performing reasonableness while being very unreasonable. He asked a lot of questions about the trust structure. He used words like fairness and family legacy and what Ruth would have wanted. He suggested gently that perhaps there had been some undue influence involved given how much time I had spent with her. And I listened to all of it. And then I said, Preston, she made this decision over 15 years with a professional estate attorney and a financial advisor. She was of sound mind and clear intention. She left the people she loved items that held meaning for them. She left me the responsibility she trusted me to carry. I am going to honor that. And he said some other things. I let him say them. And then I said, I am going to go now. I love you and I hope we can find our way back to each other, but I am not going to defend her choices or mine. And I hung up. And Dana sent me a text 3 weeks later. It said, I have been thinking about what I said at the house. The thing about the scrubs. That was cruel and I knew it when I said it, and I said it anyway. I am sorry. And I read it several times. Then I wrote back, thank you for saying that. I mean it. And we have not spoken at length since. But that text mattered. It mattered that she sent it. And I want to tell you what I have done with the trust in the 6 months since I found out about it, because I think that is the part of this story that is actually mine to tell. And the first thing I did was fund the charitable giving Grandma Ruth had specified. Veteran support organizations. A nursing scholarship fund at the school where she had trained. A rural health clinic in eastern Tennessee in the county where she was born. This did not feel like my decision. It felt like keeping a promise. And the second thing I did was take 3 weeks off work. I went to the Virginia coast where my grandmother had taken me once when I was 8 years old. I walked on the beach every morning for 3 weeks. I read. I slept. I let myself be quiet in a way I had not been in years. And the third thing I did was call my supervisor and tell her I wanted to help fund a pilot program our agency had been trying to launch for years. A housing navigator program for families in our county who were one crisis away from losing their homes. We had never had the budget. Now we did. And I did not quit my job. I thought about it. But when I sat quietly with that question, I realized that the work was not something I was doing because I had to. It was something I was doing because it was who I was. The trust changed my security, but it did not change my purpose. And I am buying a house. A modest one not far from where I work. With a guest room and a garden. I keep thinking about planting things. And I set up a small scholarship in my grandmother's name for nursing students from rural communities in Tennessee. Patricia helped me structure it. The first 2 recipients were selected last month. When I read their applications, I cried at my kitchen table the same way I had cried the night I read her letter. And what I want to say to you now is the thing I have been thinking about since that night with the box and the letter and the photographs of the young woman in Vietnam. And we live in a world that is very loud about certain kinds of value. The loud kinds. The visible kinds. The kinds that announce themselves and take up space and make sure everyone in the room is aware of their importance. And my grandmother never lived that way. She lived quietly, and she gave generously, and she paid attention carefully, and she built something real over decades. The world mostly did not notice. Her own children mostly did not notice. Her grandchildren mostly did not notice. And one of us noticed. And I do not say that with pride exactly. I say it with something more like responsibility. I noticed because I was paying attention. I paid attention because she had always made me feel like paying attention was worthwhile. She gave me that. Long before she gave me anything else. And the money is real and it is changing my life in real ways. I will not pretend otherwise. Financial security is not a small thing. It is not a trivial gift. I understand that it is changing what is possible for me in ways that I am still learning to hold. But what I come back to in the quiet moments is that letter. For pages in her careful handwriting. The photographs of the young woman she had been. The trust she had placed in me not at the end, but over decades. The long, slow accumulation of being seen. And that is what changed everything. And there is one more thing I want to tell you. And a few months ago I was going through more of her things that I had brought back from the house. In a small cedar box I found a journal. It was from 1968, the year she came home from Vietnam. And the entries from those first months home were hard to read. She had seen things that followed her. She had nightmares. She was adjusting to a world that did not quite know what to do with women who had come back from war. She wrote about feeling invisible in a way that had nothing to do with money. But then there was an entry from December of that year. She had met my grandfather Thomas at a church social. She wrote about him with this careful, restrained excitement that made me smile. She wrote, "He is quiet in the way that means he is actually listening." And then at the bottom of that entry in different ink, as though she had come back to add it later, she wrote, "I think this is what I have been looking for. Someone who understands that presence is not the same as noise." And I read that entry 3 times. And I thought about Dana's laugh. About Preston's phone call. About the years of Sunday lunches and 4-hour drives and night shifts and chemotherapy waiting rooms. And I thought about what it means to be present. To actually be present. Not to perform presence, but to give it fully and without expectation. And my grandmother had spent her whole life understanding that distinction. She had lived it in Vietnam, and she had lived it in her marriage, and she had lived it in the way she built her trust and designed her legacy. And she had given it to me. And not just the $12 million. And the understanding that the quietest choices are often the most consequential. That showing up without applause is not the same as showing up without value. That the people who are paying close attention are building something even when no one is watching. And I keep her letter in the cedar box now. Next to the journal. Next to the photographs of the young woman in Vietnam with her calm, present eyes. And on hard days I open the box. And I remember that she saw me. And I remember that being seen is everything. And I remember that I am the granddaughter of a woman who went to Vietnam and came home and lived quietly and built something real and trusted me to carry it forward. And that is who I am. And that is enough. And that is more than enough.